Hello everyone, welcome to Indian Economy by Aman. Today's news are we will be discussing the important articles related to economy from the Hindu news. In page 1 there is a news about the fuel price increase. Here we need to focus on what are the components which make the final fuel price. So there is the excise duty charged by the government, and there is the dealer commission, and there is VAT charged by the state governments, and there are prices charged by the oil marketing company. The excise duty and VAT and the dealer commission to the basic prices makes up the retail price of petrol and diesel. You could probably get an MCQ on the components of the petrol price. Here in the editorial page, this article is related to the COVID vaccine waiver and intellectual property rights in WTO. The backstory being, during the COVID pandemic, India and South Africa and certain other countries had proposed for a vaccine patent waiver so that the countries could manufacture COVID vaccine and supply at a cheaper prices, so that even these developing countries and the least developing countries could get access to vaccines at a faster rate. Because having an intellectual property right on the vaccine manufacturing would mean that the low developing countries and the least income countries, they could not afford the high patent price the fees that the vaccine manufacturers were charged. So in order to address this timely availability and affordability of medical products to all the countries in need, India, South Africa and certain other countries, they proposed for the vaccine waiver. And India and South Africa and the other proposal countries, they wanted these COVID vaccines to be treated as global public goods so that they are accessible to everyone. Initially, all the developing countries opposed this move because they were siding towards the pharmaceuticals companies. Now, USA has also come on the side of India and they are supporting the vaccine waiver. The European Union is also coming for a compromise and they are supporting that they would go for vaccine waiver but with certain terms and conditions. And what is the terms and conditions and what is the waiver about and what is the solution that European Union is providing? This article discusses about that. The European Union has said that instead of going for a complete waiver of all the rights, the waiver would be just on the COVID vaccines, but the waiver would not be on the other medical components, other medicinal devices related to COVID. It would not be on the COVID drugs, the tablets, but only on the vaccines. At a time when the world is recovering from COVID and the majority of the population of various countries have been vaccinated with one dose and certain countries have been vaccinated with two doses, the waiver will be useful only when it is given on the holistically on all the components related to COVID, on the drugs, on the medical equipment, on the vaccines. But the compromise proposal by the European Union has a catch wherein this says that the waiver is only for the vaccine manufacturing. And even there, they are not going for a complete waiver of rights. They are just saying that the government should be allowed to go for compulsory licensing. Certain countries like India already have in their patent law a provision for compulsory licensing. And what is compulsory licensing? When the price of a manufactured good, the medicine is too high, it is not accessible to the domestic people, or when the government feels that this product has to be exported to the least developing country, the government would give access to the generic manufacturers to manufacture the product without the permission of the patent holder. So when the government allows a firm to manufacture the medicine without the permission of the patent holder, that is known as compulsory licensing. And in this case, certain remuneration would be paid to the patent holder. But here again there is a catch. When it comes to compulsory licensing of the products, the manufacturing of that particular medicine is allowed without the permission of the patent holder. But what about the trade secret? What about the know-how? It is like saying you can manufacture the product, but we won't tell you what ingredients are to be used in the product, what are the components, and what is the process of manufacturing that particular product. So without telling the recipe and how to cook a food, but you are just allowed to cook the food, what would you do with the right of being allowed to cook the food? Because you don't know how to cook the food. This is the same problem. The countries are being allowed under compulsory licensing for manufacturing of the medicine, but the process and the ingredients of the vaccines and the trade secrets and know-hows, they have not been revealed. So again, what would the pharma companies of least developing countries would do? They would go into arrangements between the pharma companies of the developed countries, and they would directly deal with those companies so that they can also get the know-how. And they have also proposed a eligibility criteria wherein only those countries which are exporting less than certain percentage of global manufacturing, only those countries which export less than a certain number to the global market, only those countries would be allowed to export. Here India would not get affected because India's exports of vaccine have been just 2.4 percentage. So indirectly this eligibility criteria that they have put, it is against targeting China so that China won't be export very largely to the global market. But China is not concerned with the vaccine manufacturing because it has its own domestic versions of the vaccine. And in the TRIPS agreement of the WTO under Article 31F, there is a provision for compulsory licensing, and it must be used predominantly for the domestic supply. But these companies, the proposal by the Quad people, they are going to suggest that this has to be waived off so that the companies whichever manufacture the products, they would be exported. The author again discusses that, which we already discussed, just giving the vaccine waiver, compulsory licensing, and not allowing access to medicines, medical equipment, methods and means of manufacturing, the prevention, treatment, and the containment of COVID, there would be not be much use. And the Quad countries which are going for the waiver, which are supporting the waiver, they are having additional conditions which are not there even under the TRIPS agreement. The TRIPS agreement under the WTO didn't have this agreement compulsory licensing conditions, but these are countries are imposing the additional conditions. For example, the countries are being asked to list all the patents covered under the compulsory licensing, and the other countries have to be notified about the details of the licensee, the firm for whom the manufacture rights have been given, what is the quantity of the export, what is the destination of the export. All these details are not required even under the TRIPS agreement, but under the new conditions they are trying to impose these conditions. So the waiver that European Union is now suggesting is just a whitewash. They are giving the right, but in substance there is not a very good right that the people are getting. So what the author finally says is that India and South Africa who propose this waiver, they should not accept this compromise, because if they accept this compromise, the image that they have with the developing world would get affected, and all the people who are supporting India and South Africa for the WTO waiver, they would back down and they would feel cheated. And this is a nice opportunity for the global community to make the vaccines accessible, to give equitable access to all the countries, and we should not leave an opportunity, so that we should work towards getting the total waiver for all the vaccines, medical devices, drugs, the treatment and prevention procedures, etc. In the text and context, there is a detailed explainer about the National Monetization Corporation. 15 days back, there was a news about the government creating the National Land Monetization Corporation. This article detailedly discusses about the various provisions. Could be very important for prelims. What is the National Land Monetization Corporation? The National Land Monetization Corporation, as the name suggests, is mainly focused towards monetizing the additional and unused land that the government holds. Currently, various departments of the government, various central public sector undertakings hold excess of land which they have not been using. For example, the central public sector undertakings hold almost 3,400 acres of land which are not being used, and other non-core asset areas of certain public sector units like MTNL, BSNL. BSNL, for example, has a 25,000 crore worth of properties which are not being effectively used. So that is additional capacity lying with BSNL. So the government is planning to use this and provide this to the private sector and get revenue out of this land use. Even railways have almost 11 lakh acres of land, of which 1.25 lakh acres are vacant. The Defense Ministry almost has 18 lakh acres of land, of which 1.6 lakh acres fall inside the cantonments and 16 lakh acres fall outside the cantonment areas. So all this land could be put for productive use and the government could also get for revenue generation. This, for example, to put in simple words, you have a huge property or a factory, you are using certain part of that, but certain part of it you're not using that. So if you are smart enough, what would you do? You would rent that portion to someone and get rent, right? The government is planning to do the same thing. In order to carry out the monetization of the government's surplus land holdings, the government has made this special purpose vehicle called the National Land Monetization Corporation. This corporation, it is fully owned by the government, and any surplus unused and underused land of the government would be monetized under it. It comes under the administrative jurisdiction of the Finance Ministry. It has an authorized capital of 5,000 crore and a paid up capital of 150 crore. Authorized capital means the company is authorized under the company has permission under the registered document that it can raise 5,000 crores, that it can go up, the capital could go up to 5,000 crores. It is authorized for the capital to go up to 5,000 crores. And paid up capital is that part of the authorized capital for which the amount is actually paid. So the government is saying that this company could be made into a 5,000 crore worth of capital company, but currently we are just investing 150 crore into it. So we are paying 150 crore into the company and we are starting that corporation. Apart from land monetization, this company would also facilitate the monetization of assets belonging to PSUs which have stopped the operation or which are in line for the strategic disinvestment, so that the extra potential of these companies would be unlocked, and all the surplus assets of various enterprises would be transferred to this land monetization corporation, so that this monetization corporation would hold, manage and monetize these assets and generate revenue to the government. By transferring the additional land assets to this monetization corporation, it will help in increasing the disinvestment process, because the additional land holdings are already transferred to this NLMC. So whatever is left would be attractive to the private sector, and it would also lead to the productive utilization of underused assets. We just discussed in the example where you have the additional factory capacity and you are renting that. Now you are not productively using it. By someone using it and you getting rent in return, you are productively using it, you are putting it for full utilization of resources. And this would also mean that the private sector would be interested to invest into this particular assets. They would be invested in developing the assets for a long term, and it would also increase the employment in the local areas. It would provide jobs to the youth. Apart from these functions, the monetization corporation would also act like an advisory body, wherein it would advise the government entities and central public sector units in identifying the surplus non-core assets and helping them in monetizing those. For this manner, it would work as a professional body. So the article also talks about monetization. In simple words, what is monetization? Monetization is you're getting the money from out of it. You're getting the revenue out of something. When would you get the revenue out of something? When you would give the asset to some other person and you would rent it or you would sell it, you would get the revenue money out of it. Here, the revenue rights of that asset could be transferred to the private sector person. Whether it could be land, infrastructure like additional factory capacity, or a central public sector undertakings additional land or capacity. The revenue generating rights would be transferred to a private player for a certain period of time, for which the private entity would pay the government an upfront payment. They would pay a fixed sum of payment, and the contract would also have a clause wherein a regular share of revenue generated, like out of the revenue generated from that asset, the private sectors would be asked to pay some 20% or 30% of revenue every year. So apart from the upfront payment, the advance payment that the government gets, it would also get additional revenue every year generated out of the asset. But here the title rights, the ownership of the asset would be kept with the government itself currently. Just the revenue generating right would be given to the private sector. It is like you have the land in your name, but you are just leasing the land to someone else to cultivate, and whatever the produce comes out of that produce, you would get certain portion, and the person who is cultivating gets certain portion. Finally, at the end of the period, you will get the ownership of your land back, and whatever the improvements that person has made to the land during the time of cultivation is additional benefits that you would reap once the land comes back to you. And there are multiple ways of monetizing. For example, for office spaces and additional factory utilization, it could be done through the real estate investment trust, and for huge land we could go for public private partnerships. And why should the government monetize? For the basic fact, it would generate more revenue, and it would unlock the potential of unused and underused assets. We could, it could lead to the efficient utilization of resources. And in we discussed in the land example where whatever the additional capital infrastructure that person who was cultivating has made, that would remain once the person leaves that back to you. So all that is additional benefit to you. So whatever the capital investment the private sector has made to the asset, all that would remain to the government once the time period of the project is over. So it is revenue, it is for the efficient utilization and to promote the capital investments into the asset. And how will the NLMC function? NLMC would hire professionals from the private sector for this purpose, because monetization of land and real estate requires certain expertise in terms of valuation of the property, in terms of market research, investment banking, land management. For all these purposes, professionals would be hired from the market. But like anything else, everything would have challenges. What are the challenges that this NLMC would face? The performance and productivity of this land monetization corporation would directly depend on the performance of the disinvestment process of the government. For example, last year in the budget, the government had set a disinvestment target of 1.7 lakh crore. Then they revised the disinvestment target to 78,000 crores. But the actual realization was just 12,000 crores. So even when the government wanted to disinvestment Air India, initially no one was taking it. Finally, the Tata Group came in and they took over Air India. And out of the 78,000 crore target, the main 60,000 crores come from the LIC IPO. Now, because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the volatility in the market, the government is currently not proceeding with the LIC IPO, because if the government goes for IPO now, the IPO would flop. So the government is waiting for the right time. If the LIC IPO doesn't take place, out of the 78,000 target, you're not going to meet the 60,000 target. So government would miserably fail in its disinvestment target. So the authors are saying that the performance of this NLMC would directly depend on how much the government is able to do. Because here we are talking about monetizing the additional units of the public sector units which are going to be disinvested. If nobody takes the disinvestment assets, what would you do with the additional assets that the same company has? And the another challenge would be the government is expecting the private sector to invest into the capital infrastructure. Why would the private player invest into the infrastructure if they think that they are not going to get enough returns out of it? To take an example, the government wanted to privatize running 150 trains in certain areas, but when the bids were thrown open, only 9 in the 9 cluster of railways, there were no bidders at all. And even in 2 clusters where there were bidders, one of the bidders was IRCTC, which is railways own firm, and there are no serious bidders for this infrastructure and disinvestment PSUs. So the article says when there are no private sector people who want to take up these assets, what would happen to the plan? The plan would flop. And even when there are takers, there are just one or two people who are ready to take. And if one or two persons take over it, it would lead to monopoly or it would lead to duopoly. Duopoly is a situation where two sellers are controlling the market. Monopoly, mono means single. Monopoly is a situation where a single seller is controlling the market. So it would either lead to monopoly or duopoly when there are only one or two bidders. So what the government has to do? It has to quickly increase its disinvestment so that there would be takers for this monetization. The business page, you can just read the headings today. And in this article, it just discusses about currently the time lag for employment data is 9 months. The employment data that we are going from the periodic labor survey is taking more than 9 months, and the 9 months period is too long because we can't take any policy decision based on the data correctly. So the data, we have to slowly reduce the time to 6 or 7 months initially, then to 4 5 months, and then finally we have to align it with the GDP level so that it would come to the quarterly. Again, here we just need to read the headlines. Same here, no need to go to all this, just the headlines are enough. These are the articles related to economy today. Thank you so much.